So, like you just heard, my name is Brianna Cunliffe. I usually go by Brie, like the cheese, if that helps you remember my name. And I'm really happy to be part of this Scientist to Go series as a social scientist. And I guess I'll kick this off by asking this question of, what is social science? It can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people in the broadest possible sense, right? It's the study of humans. It's the study of the systems that humans create and the ways that humans interact with each other. So, social science can mean anything from economics, right? The study of how humans make and manage our money, to psychology, trying to understand the way that humans interact with each other, behave towards one another, and feel. Social science also includes policy. So, what are the rules that humans make? How do those rules come into being? And how might they change or fail to change or need to change? For me, my journey was so, oopsies. For me, my journey with social science really started with asking the question of what's next, right? Talking and thinking about climate change and my personal experiences being impacted by climate change, which I'll talk more about in a moment, and looking around at all of the amazing science that was happening, right? All of the incredible people working so hard to get us good data on changing sea levels, warming oceans, carbon dioxide emissions, the impacts on plants and animals, all of this amazing information at our disposal, and yet feeling like not much was happening with it, or like the people around me weren't really aware, or if they were aware, they might not really know what to do with that information. So I started asking the question, how do people connect with science, especially when we think about planning for the future? And it was related for me to this question of how do we work together? And we have these enormous problems that we're facing, these really big challenges. And sometimes there's a lot that goes wrong when we try to tackle them together. There's a lot of barriers that stand in the way. And are there things that we could be doing differently that it's not going to make the problem less hard to solve, but it's going to make us more capable of solving it if we can find better ways of collaborating? And so I mentioned earlier that climate change became personal for me at a really young age. I am from a place called Wilmington, North Carolina. And underneath all the data on this map, which I'll talk about in a second, you can see it's kind of just at the southern tip of North Carolina, almost South Carolina. And it's a peninsula, so it's almost an island. It's this narrow strip of land right here. And I'm very fortunate that it's a beautiful place. So I grew up really connected to the sea. I grew up surfing, swimming, having these daily interactions with this incredibly beautiful landscape. But I also grew up seeing it change and seeing it increasingly impacted by hurricanes that were getting worse and worse. You know, when I was a kid, it was always kind of normal. We'd have a couple of hurricanes per year. We'd get a half day off school if it was too windy or rainy. But then as I got older, as I got into middle school and high school, the storms started happening more and more often, and they started getting more and more severe and damaging, right? Friends that I knew would lose parts of their houses, roads that we would travel would be washed out. And that kind of came to a peak when Hurricane Florence came. And Hurricane Florence actually hit Wilmington my very first week away from home in college. So I had just gotten to college in Maine, and this massive storm slammed right into Wilmington. And that little peninsula that I was talking about earlier was turned into an island for a couple of days. And I wasn't able to hear from my parents for a few days because all the phone lines were down too. And it was really scary. And it was a real reckoning moment for me of thinking, oh, okay, this is here now. These impacts are here now. And it's really important to me to feel like my education and my career can be part of figuring out what we do about it. And so that actually took me here to Maine to Bowdoin College. I'm sure some of you know Bowdoin or have been to Brunswick. And I had an amazing 4 years here adjusting to the cold. Um, and I was part of the environmental studies program at Bowdoin, which I really loved because it was kind of a mixture of everything. So there was some science that was part of it, there was some history that was part of it, there was some social science, there was just a mixture of a bunch of different things because environmental problems are really multidimensional. There's a lot of different causes, a lot of different impacts. And so we got to kind of study how it all came together. Um, Also, when I was at Bowdoin, I got the chance to work on Kent Island Scientific Station, which is a tiny, and I mean tiny, about 1 mile total area island in the Gulf of Maine. And I got to live out there with a bunch of researchers. But I was there actually as a writer in residence. So I had the amazing job of being able to go out with my friends on their projects. I would go out with my friend Max to survey tree species. I would go out with my friend Hannah and we would catch pollinators for her to do her pollinator network experiments on. I would go walk tidal transects and look at kelp with my friend Jessie. And then it would be my job to tell the story of the work that they were doing, right? To kind of translate all the numbers that we were collecting in the data sheets and the complicated species names into something that we could share with the person we ran into at the grocery store when we went to go resupply on the mainland, or that you could talk to about with your grandma on the phone, right? Without her eyes glazing over or her losing interest. And I loved that. I loved that I got to be around all of this amazing science. Um, I've always loved science, but I've always known that I wasn't going to be a researcher, right? It's just not with the way my brain works. It's not what brings me joy. But I realized that I could be connected to science really closely, and that I could be a part of making sure that science had a real impact on the world by making sure that people understood and felt connected to the results of science. And as I was having this realization, I was also learning more and more about social science. And so, as part of my thesis at Bowdoin, so when I say thesis, I just basically mean a big, long project. Um, I decided to focus on energy, right? I had already decided that I wanted to tackle climate change, and I thought that energy was a really important part of doing that. And so I started practicing social science research methods. And what that looks like in practice is a lot of times going out and talking to people. So I did a bunch of interviews. And so, I would sit down with people, I would ask them my questions, they would give me their responses. And ordinarily, right, like this is kind of where we leave it. We say, okay, I had this interview, I learned what I learned, and now I'm just going to go move on to the next thing. But in social science, we actually have a way of making sense of the data that we get in interviews, of kind of saying, okay, well, what does this mean, right? We've interviewed these 12 people on this topic, and they're all agreeing about these parts of it, but they have really different answers when it comes to this part of it. What's going on, and what does it mean for us in the future? So, this graphic is more of a marketing example, but it kind of shows the process of doing something that's called coding, right? So you go through what people said and you say, oh, okay, here they mentioned product quality and they felt good about it. Or, oh, here they mentioned customer service and they didn't feel so good about it. And by doing this process, you can identify what seems to be happening a lot, right? Like what might be a trend. Or you can say, huh, well, that's interesting. Everybody who was under the age of 20 felt this way about a certain issue. Everybody over the age of 20 felt a really different way. I wonder what's going on. Or I wonder if we might need to use different language when we're talking to these people. I wonder if we might need to reach out in a different way to these different groups. So that was really the start for me of understanding what social science could do and that it might be a really great place for me to fit in. So again, I started college with this question of feeling really overwhelmed about climate change and wondering, okay, what can I do about it? what do me, Bree, with my brain and heart and my personality, where do I fit into this big question? And I knew a couple of things at that point. I knew that community, nature, and storytelling were really important to me. And I knew that we had a lot of amazing science behind the struggle to combat the climate crisis. We had a lot of amazing data on what was changing, and we had a lot of amazing technologies out there that are solutions, right? But we weren't quite working together in the way that we needed to be. The human dimension of figuring out how to make this work is where there's a lot of work to do. And I was also thinking about this related tool by someone called Dr. Ayanna Elizabeth Johnson. And she presents this kind of climate action Venn diagram. Some of you might be familiar with this. I think it's an amazing tool. And the way that it works is you kind of ask yourself three questions. You first ask yourself, what brings you joy? And then you ask yourself, what are you good at? And then you ask, what work needs doing? So for me, I know that what brings me joy is interacting with people, being in community and seeing things actually get done, and being connected to nature, being outside, not just being behind a desk. And I knew that I was good at communicating, right? I was good at telling the story of science, and I was good at kind of figuring out how different pieces of a puzzle fit together. And like I just said, I knew that there was a lot of work that needed to be doing in the social aspects of this problem. And so I decided to dive deeper into social science by working for the National Park Service. So not a lot of people know this. Usually they think if you're a park ranger, you're just out working on trails or telling visitors to get away from the bears. But a lot of national parks actually have a social science team. So once I graduated from college, I joined the social science team for Grand Teton National Park out in Wyoming. And I got to go and conduct interviews with people. I would ask them where they came from, why they chose this park, why they were drawn to this experience. I would observe people's behaviors on the trails. We would do projects to kind of assess whether our bear safety communications were working. We would give the park data about how many people visited each spot, how long did they stay there, were they following the rules? And all of that data, all of that information that we collected as social scientists, we could use to help the people in charge of the park make better decisions, right? So they would know what visitors were looking for, what they were thinking about, and where to invest in the future. I had a fantastic time in Grand Teton National Park. This is me and my whole crew. But even though I was really passionate about the work I was doing in public lands, it felt really important to me to get back to climate, to get back to climate change, to get back to trying to tackle the climate crisis in a bit more of a hands-on way. I also really wanted to come back to Maine. And so as a result of that, I decided to join the Island Institute's Fellows Program. Some of you might know a little bit about the Fellows Program. The essence of it is that there are different islands and coastal communities up and down the coast of Maine that will come to the Island Institute, which is a nonprofit dedicated to those islands and coastal communities, with a project. And they'll say, hey, we really want to tackle this problem. We would love an extra set of hands. And then the Island Institute essentially plays matchmaker between those islands and a young person interested in doing that work. And so I was really interested in this program, and I got very, very lucky because the match that they made for me was with Mount Desert Island, home of Acadia National Park, a completely dreamy place to live and work, and with an amazing organization called A Climate to Thrive. And A Climate to Thrive actually got started when a group of neighbors started talking to one another about climate change. These were just casual conversations, in the grocery store, at yoga class. And these neighbors and friends started talking more and more about what their worries were, what their hopes were, what they thought that they could maybe do about it. And these conversations turned into potluck dinners. And these potluck dinners eventually turned into a nonprofit where I eventually worked that works with all of the different towns on Mount Desert Island and really across the state to try to figure out what we can do about the climate crisis from exactly where we are, starting from the community level up. So here's me with my amazing team. It was also so awesome to get to work with a team of all ladies. Really special experience. And I'm still very, very close with these wonderful humans now. And here's me and my dog. Her name's Fern, up on top of a mountain in Acadia. The other amazing thing about getting to take my social science lens to working on policy on a local level was getting to connect with my fellow fellows. So all of the different island fellows lived and worked on different islands up and down the coast of Maine, and we were all working on really different issues. But even though one person was working on food access issues in Stonington, and someone else was working on technology education on Vinyl Haven, or someone else was working on how sea level rise impacts a harbor. What we discovered talking and collaborating with one another was that actually all of our work was really interconnected and that we were able to do our jobs better by understanding the whole holistic environment of this place and just by being around a group of smart and thoughtful people. So I love my fellow fellows to this day, and it's a fantastic program for anybody who is looking to do work that is really rooted in community. And when thinking about the work that I was actually doing during my time as an Island Fellow, incorporating that social science lens, it might kind of look like we spent a lot of time playing games. And this comes down to something in social science that we call a participatory approach, which is kind of a fancy way of saying people actually getting involved in the process of planning for that can sometimes be for policy, right? So how are we going to make the rules about this particular thing that we're going to do? What are we going to do about sea level rise? That sort of policy and planning for the future. And the typical way that that happens is sometimes someone will give a presentation, everybody else will sit there and listen, and they might raise their hand and ask a question, or they might send an email with their thoughts and opinions, and then that's kind of that. But what we were really interested in was seeing if we could get people involved in a more meaningful way, knowing that, people know their community well, kids in schools, elders who have lived there for generations, they know these places. They know what's going to work and what's not going to work. And so we would have these events as we were trying to do this work of planning for the future to really try to involve people. We would gather around maps together. We would, in this photo, you can see people are voting. In social sciences, we call this dotmocracy, which stands for dot democracy, which is essentially, okay, we have a bunch of different options. Everybody gets a sticker that's a dot, and you can vote and see which one we want to tackle or what feels most important. And then you can all sort of look at this thing that you've created together and have a conversation from there about where to go next. On the right here, actually, this is from a collaboration with the Gulf of Maine Research Institute, where they brought this activity called Planning Forward to our community, and we kind of helped them host it. And we are literally playing a board game. But from this game that we sat together and played that laid out different options for the future, there were real changes that were made in our towns because of the experiences that we had together playing this sort of serious game. And so overall, what we were doing was what we were sort of trying to do is something that we thought of as community-driven climate action. And so there's actions or there's policies that might start with a national government saying, this thing has to happen, or we're taking this approach now. And then everybody else kind of, it trickles down onto everybody else. What we were attempting to do, informed by this social science perspective, was to actually to start very locally, to start with a group of people together in a room, and thinking about, what are our shared values? What are our perceptions of the place where we are? What do we want? What are some things that we agree on that we want? Or where are areas where we disagree? And what might be behind those disagreements? And are there actions that we can take that actually benefit us, even if we might not agree on everything? And so that's the general approach. And it's work that happens in one very particular place that can ripple outward. And so I had the task of kind of informed by social science, a little bit like writing a research paper, but not quite. Like with my thesis, I was doing these interviews, I was collecting this data, I was drawing in all this information. But this time, it wasn't with the aim of writing a paper or generating a study, it's with the aim of creating a policy, right? Creating some kind of document, of roadmap for the community that I was in to navigate into the future. And so that was part of what I spent my 2 years. I talked to people about what they wanted, about what they were worried about. And then I translated that into this policy document that the community then got to vote on at town meeting. And oh man, was this a nerve-wracking moment for me. But we had this really, really wonderful feedback that we got in the form of when this vote was held, 90 people voted yes, and only one person voted no. And hey, I'll take that. Um, but this work, of course, wasn't happening in isolation. And so this is a social science tool, like analysis project called a social network analysis. And this is just a screenshot of it. But I'm actually going to see if I can go into the website and click through it a little bit. Yeah, I won't spend too much time on this, but I'm a nerd, so I think it's really, really cool. You can see all of these different connective parts and how they move around together. So, for example, I can go in and I can click here and, oh, this is a nonprofit, right? This nonprofit is connected to this other nonprofit, and that's connected to this municipality. Oh, and then that municipality is also connected here. So, this is just another example of a tool that social science gives us for understanding how connected we all are and the ripple effects that can happen in everything from policy to advocacy to disaster response, right? When something happens to one of these communities, it's not just about that community, it's about the whole network that they're connected to. And understanding that can really, really be helpful as we move into the future. Another way of thinking about that network is, if we have the same goal, that's the trunk of the tree. And then there are all of these different branches, all of these different places where different people, different organizations can all fit in. And I was really interested in understanding how these networks operate and how we can build better, stronger networks that are more able to deal with the challenges of the future. And to do that and to keep learning more about social science and to grow as a social science researcher, I decided to go to graduate school. And I went to graduate school in Iceland, which is actually where I currently am right now. It's cold and snowy here, but it's actually warmer in Iceland than it is in Maine, funnily enough. So I live here in a town called Isafjordur. It is a very, very small town on the edge of the Arctic Circle. Here's me up in the mountains after herding some sheep, and here's me and a lot of my research colleagues attending the Arctic Circle. So I decided to go to graduate school to be able to embark on this research project that goes back to my place in this kind of climate Venn diagram, which is my dedication and my ability to translating the insights of science and figuring out how people can work together to collaboratively plan for the future in a way that gets us there with less conflict, with less infighting, with less barriers standing in our way. And there's a lot of really exciting, complicated energy questions that are happening here in Iceland. I won't go too much into them because I know that we are running low on time and I want you to have time to ask questions. But these are some images from my new home in Iceland. I hope that you've learned at least a little bit about what social science and what a career in social science can look like and some of the cool places it can take you. Social science has taken me from, again, a tiny little island in the Gulf of Maine to back to my hometown to solve questions that are really important to me. And now it's taken me to Iceland with the whales and with the Northern Lights. And I'm still early in my career, so I don't know where it's going to take me next. But I know that it's helped me really find my personal way that I can leverage what I'm good at with the work that I think really needs to get done. So I will leave it there. And thank you very much for listening. And I'm really happy to take any questions. Let me see if there's any in the chat.
Yeah, thank you so much. If anyone has questions, please feel free to throw them into the chat. I know I have a few just in case, but that was a really thought-provoking presentation, so I'm sure we'll have some coming in. One thing that I always like to ask is, what are you excited about in your fields right now? Like maybe not necessarily your work specifically, but anyone you know in your field, what are you excited about? What's happening?
Ooh, that's such a fun question. I am really excited about, so actually one of my courses right now in my graduate program is on GIS, which is an acronym that stands for Geographical Information Systems, kind of a fancy way of saying map making. And I love maps. And one of my colleagues is there's a bunch of work going on in this area, but is actually doing something that's called, right, like participatory mapping, which is actually working with people, with citizens to create maps, specifically maps of places that are important. So when we think about a community in Maine, right, that might be challenged by sea level rise, or a community here in Iceland that might face avalanche risk, it's really important to know where people feel safe in their communities, where people are attached to their communities, where they want to see a bike lane, where they don't want to see a bike lane. And so this project actually does walking interviews with people and then uses this really cool software to turn those walking interviews into a map that sort of shows where people have emotional connections to their landscape, which I just think is so cool and such a useful way of kind of bridging that gap between planning and reality. So that's one thing I'm excited about is um, really cool mapping projects that incorporate social science. Oh, you're muted,
Yeah.
Zoe. Did I?
I feel like I've seen a lot of maps that show like ecosystem services, so like what the
Yeah,
environment can do for us. But I think it's really cool to kind of flip that on its head and be like, well, what do we get from the environment, like emotionally or socially? Very cool. We have a few questions
totally.
coming from classrooms. So the first one that popped up was, what is one of the weirdest things you've encountered in your studies? I know you've been kind of all over the place, so.
Oh my gosh, what is one of the weirdest things that I've encountered? That's an awesome question. Um, I think I think one thing that I've encountered that is a funny quirk of being a social scientist is oftentimes you're doing interviews. So you're talking to people, right? And then sometimes this happens, you know, in a public setting. Sometimes you go into people's homes and you talk to them. If you're especially if you're trying to interview someone about an important issue, you're maybe sitting down with them for an hour. And I had an interview as part of this research project I was working on in North Carolina. And the thing about working with humans is it's not like studying fish, right? Like you can't really predict or control what they're going to do next. So this interview with this gentleman who was a lovely person was supposed to take about half an hour, 45 minutes for me to ask all my question, and ended up being 2 hours long while he told me his whole life story. And he tried to offer me some venison from a deer that he had just killed as part of the interview, which was a very lovely Southern hospitality, but did not exactly go according to plan. So that's probably one of the funkiest situations I've been in.
Oh my goodness. Yeah. So interviews sound like they can kind of go in so many directions.
Absolutely.
Um, Another question is, do they speak a different language in Iceland?
They do. So most Icelanders speak English also. I'd say like 90% of people speak very, very good English. They learn it in school at the same time as they learn Icelandic, but they also speak Icelandic, which, oh gosh, if you've never heard Icelandic, Google it and listen to some sentences. It is a very, very complicated language with a lot of different letters. So I've been learning a very, very small bit of Icelandic, but luckily I don't really need to do research in Icelandic because that would be very difficult.
Yeah, definitely. Another question is, what could Mainers learn from how Iceland tackles climate change?
Oh, I love this question. It's such a good question. Iceland is, well, okay, a lot of people point to Iceland as a real leader in renewable energy, which is absolutely true. However, Iceland did get a pretty big head start because Iceland has a lot of something that's known as geothermal energy. So, because there's a lot of volcanic activity here in Iceland, they figured out early on that they could harness that energy and have this amazing renewable source of energy that powers a lot of their country. So, yes, they are huge leaders in renewable energy. They did have a bit of a head start. But I think Mainers can have a lot to learn from Iceland because the weather here is really wild and really crazy. But the power almost never goes out. I live in one of the most remote places in Iceland, and every now and then the power will flicker for a moment. But what Iceland has managed to do is they have a bunch of um, it's kind of a complicated term, but microgrids, right? Which is essentially sections of the power grid where if something goes wrong somewhere else down the line, that part of the grid can stay on because there's a backup generator, right? So my whole town actually runs on a backup generator that's one town over. So if the big line connecting us to the capital city goes out in a storm, we still have heat, we still have light, we still have all of our energy infrastructure. And I know for a lot of us in Maine, we've experienced some, depending on where you live, long-lasting blackouts in the past couple of years. And that's really not only is our grid not being in the best shape bad for climate action, it's also just kind of dangerous for all of us. And so Iceland does an amazing job managing their grid, which means that they can do a lot with renewable energy. So I think that's one major way that we can learn from Iceland is their grid. It's not very exciting to talk about like power lines, but it's a hugely important part of the energy transition.
Yeah, especially with all of the storms that we had in Maine last winter. I know there was
Yes.
big power outages all up the coast for long periods of time. So
Yeah,
we can definitely learn from other countries with their electric grids.
definitely.
Um, Another question is, what has inspired you most or impressed you most in nature throughout this journey of yours?
Oh man. Oh, it's such an also a really, really wonderful question. I think I living here in Iceland has been such a huge gift, and I'm thinking about it now because we had a really remarkable display of this last night, the Northern Lights, the Aurora Borealis. Just oh, it never ceases to astonish me. I know that it was visible actually in Maine a little bit some parts of the year, so maybe some of you caught a glimpse of that, but it's just so stunning. I think it reminds me that we are a small part of a very complicated system. And that helps me take a bit of a deep breath and get a sense of perspective. So I'd say the aurora, but I'd also love the mountains. I can't choose.
One of the natural wonders of the world is the aurora.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, another question is, where did you find your work has been most inspiring between the places you've lived?
Ooh. Hmm. I don't think this isn't quite fair to Iceland yet, since I've only lived here for about 5 months. But I think one of the things that I really loved about being an island fellow and living on Mount Desert Island was that the work that I was doing was directly connected to the place that I lived every day. So my neighbors that I would see at the grocery store, that at the post office, at the library, the place where I was walking my dog, the seawall and the forest and the vegetation. It was all, that's what I was spending every day working on. And it just helped me feel really connected to the place that I lived and to the people around me. And so, and that feeling of also getting to see a project all the way through from start to finish was really amazing. It's kind of rare in research to really get to do that, especially in an academic setting when you're doing sort of research for a paper for a publication. It's a little bit more, there's not that sense of right like start and finish. It's more of an ongoing process, which in many ways I love. But when I was in Maine, to get to see that planned through from it just being an idea that I was talking about in rooms with my neighbors to it now being a finished document that's in action was really, really inspiring to me.
Yeah, I also lived in Acadia National Park and I loved the area. It was really amazing. Um, okay, so I'm seeing a question. Who is your favorite colleague? Maybe we can think about it as a, do you have any colleagues that you really have enjoyed working with or that do inspirational work?
Ooh, oh my gosh. I definitely can't pick a favorite colleague, but I will say that so my supervisor and really just a mentor and a dear friend of mine, Johanna Blackman, who was one of the founders of A Climate to Thrive, which is the organization that I was working with on Mount Desert Island, um, is definitely, I think, the person that I have learned the most from. And I think that one of the reasons for that is that she's an amazing mentor in terms of, at your job, you don't stop being a human being, right? You don't just check your humanity at the door, especially when you're working on something like climate change. It can be really intense and really emotional and really difficult. And she always inspired us and modeled for us, right? Like showing up as a full human and letting other people in the room be fully human too, and being honest about where you're feeling and where you're at. And that doesn't make you less of a researcher or less of a professional to care about the work that you do, and to also nourish a life outside of that so that you can show up and keep doing the work that you love doing. So I'll say I will always thank Johanna for that.
Yeah, that's I completely agree with I love those like same traits in all of my colleagues and supervisors. All right, we have another question. Do you have a guess for how many people you've interviewed in your career?
Ooh. Oh man, I've probably hit the 50 mark. I'd say I'm somewhere between 50 and 100 at this. No, like 50 and 75 at this point. Some of which were short, some of which were like the 2 hour life story. Most somewhere in between.
Pretty awesome. Okay, and then I think this would be a really fun sign-off question, but a request for you to say something in Icelandic, like
Ooh.
even hello or how are you, or maybe goodbye.
Yes, okay. Um, let's see. Um, Hi, ég heimli Brianna. Takk fyrir komuna. Ik flugelander Íslanda.
Okay. What would that
and
translate
and and then
to?
goodbye in Icelandic is bless. So and everybody says bless bless.
Bless, bless. Oh, so fun. Well, thank you so much, Brianna. Brianna, this was really exciting for me personally, but I know that I'm sure these classrooms enjoyed it as well. I'm actually going to I'm going to stop recording our presentation really quick.